I think we're ready to start. Welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people have been able to come along tonight. We're really pleased that you've been able to join us and hear the speakers that we have lined up for you for this important forum. So firstly, I'm Mari Hapke. I'm a member of the ARAN committee, the Australian Refugee Action Network committee, and we've organised this forum together with Amnesty International. Firstly, I'd like to mention the recording is, the meeting will be recorded, so if you don't wish to have your image on the recording, of course, you need to turn your camera off. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge, as we all know, that we're all, wherever we are, we're meeting on the lands of traditional owners, and that we know that this land was never ceded. So I'd like to pay on our behalf, pay respects to elders of all those lands and the Aboriginal communities that continue to live in our communities and on the land, and acknowledge their place as the First Nations people of this country. I'd also like to make a special mention of refugees and people who are seeking asylum, especially welcome if any of you are with us tonight, and also acknowledge the suffering that they have endured as a result of the cruel and harsh policies of this government. This and many previous governments as well, as we know so well. We've organised this forum tonight in association with Palm Sunday. Many of you might be aware that Palm Sunday is this Sunday, the 10th of April. It's a very important date in the calendar for social justice. I think there's a long tradition, as we all know, of peace marches and so forth on Palm Sunday. And in recent years, the refugee movement has organised across Australia in capital cities and in local areas as well, actions on Palm Sunday to draw attention to the injustices and the difficulties around the refugee policies. So you'll hear a bit more about that towards the end of the forum. We've got some information and some actions for you at the end. But tonight, we want to particularly focus on how it could be so different. It doesn't need, we all know, it doesn't need to be the way it has been. It's been a very, very dark couple of decades in Australia's history in terms of the way that refugees and people seeking asylum have been treated. And so tonight we want to focus on how it could perhaps be so much different and the sorts of policies we'd like to see. And our speakers will obviously elaborate on that. At the end, there'll be a brief Q&A. You're able to put questions into the chat if you wish. The chat's not an open chat, but you are able to communicate with the hosts, several of the hosts. We won't be able to answer all the questions, of course, but we'll do our best to answer some of the questions or have speakers answer some of the questions. So I think without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Craig. I think we're going to, Gordon, I'm just talking to our admin person now. Gordon, I think if you can pin Craig, that would be terrific. So I think Craig Foster's probably well known to many of you. He is now a very well-known, outspoken and energetic advocate and human rights activist. And we're very grateful to that for you, Craig, because I think you've been a wonderful voice in the refugee movement in the last, I'm not sure how long it is, 2, 3, 4 years. It seems it all blurs for me, but it's been some time. We all know that prior to this, you had a career in soccer, and I think the fact that you've had that background, you've got influence in those spheres, which I think is a powerful, not the only aspect of your advocacy, but it is a powerful reach that certainly the refugee movement previously has not had that kind of reach, I think, into the sporting community. But I know that it goes much beyond that now. You gave an address at the National Press Club recently. I know you're now speaking sort of circuit around human rights, and that's fabulous. So can I throw to you, Craig? Thank you for a few comments to open up this forum for us.
Okay, yes, thank you. Look, I'm delighted to be here tonight, and it's always great to see the refugee advocacy community come together to discuss, where things are at and where things should be headed. I know that you're discussing, what sane, measured, reasonable policy should look like in future, and I of course hugely welcome that. I won't be around for it. I'm just joining for the first few minutes here to, I guess, just give you some opening thoughts. And just give you my time, out of respect for what you've done, all of you, for such a very, very long period, much longer than me, as Marie was saying before. I've only been talking about these issues for the last few years. I do think sport has had an important role to play. It is a very visible social institution, it's a very powerful one, and particularly in Australia, which of course has a very strong sporting culture. Athletes, former athletes, sports clubs and the like have quite a powerful platform to be able to speak to a different cohort of Australia who haven't really been engaged in this issue so much in recent decades, and tend not to be engaged in what they would generally see as a political nature of what, of course, is an apolitical phenomenon of the breach of refugee rights in Australia. As you mentioned, I made a brief presentation recently at the National Press Club, and I'll just share that here now. And in that, I was at pains to go back in order for Australia to go forward. And I know that many of you will feel the same way, but having been involved in Indigenous rights for a very long period, including when I was playing, and refugee rights in just recent years, it doesn't take long to recognise that, the racism that still feeds throughout Australian society, from pre-federation and from colonisation, is a very significant part of our ongoing cycle of demonisation of other. And that, in actual fact, in the last 20 years, and I note a comment there saying that it's 30 years anniversary, very sad anniversary this year, of mandatory detention, which was, of course, introduced by the Keating government. And during the course of putting that speech together, I went back to read some of the speeches in Parliament around that initial bill. And what's really striking is how far we've come or how far backwards we've gone, if you like, in a very, very short space of time. When you read all of those opening statements in Parliament, they're predominantly measured. I remember the immigration of the minister of the time saying, look, this is only very short term. It's for a maximum of 273 days, I think it was, and we couldn't, there's no way we would ever call upon this Parliament to support anything greater than that. And so there was this whole feeling around that even the concept of mandatory detention was complicated, was actually wrong, but it was the wrong response to what was happening at that time, in a similar trigger to what has happened, to refugees in since 2001. But the comments do really give us a very strong sense that when you have high concentration of media playing into this area and demonizing constantly and getting the falsehoods and wrong messages into the Australian national consciousness, anything really is possible. The point I made in the speech and why I see refugee rights in Australia as being so incredibly important is because it's one of the areas where we have sunk the lowest in terms of our own humanity. And that what we've done to innocent refugees has bled out into broader society. It's desensitized all of us to pain and suffering. If you go back then to 92, and people would project ahead to think that we could ever have locked people up and still have, I think, around 31 Medivac refugees still locked up today and over 200 still offshore. It would be literally unbelievable. And that's not very long ago. Today, there's nothing that's unbelievable, and I don't think there's very little that's impossible. For example, the externalisation and criminalisation of Indian Australians trying to return home during COVID. That's an extraordinary place for a country to be. I think we might have been the only one in the world. If not, we were one of very few that actually said to our own country people, you are not allowed back because we're here to save ourselves. We deem ourselves more important than you. And in fact, if you come back, you're going to pay a fine of $15,000 and potential jail time. That's an extraordinary place for Australia to be, to even consider that that's possible. I found it absolutely amazing, and yet very much part of the same overall conceptual and intellectual infrastructure of exclusion that we've really struggled with throughout our 230 plus years post-colonisation history. And the point of the speech was we really have to deal with this. Otherwise, what really concerns me, and this goes to the rest of your discussion, is what's going to happen in future. You know, we've got Australia who's recalcitrant on the international stage in terms of climate action. We don't want to help our local Pacific neighbours. We've got huge human displacement in Bangladesh from floods only in recent years. We've got rising droughts. We've got severe climatic conditions all around the world, and a level of human displacement in the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years that's unprecedented, perhaps outside of war. And even then, it's going to be much greater. And here you have Australia, who has played a very significant role in debilitating the international compact around human migration. Who has a country that has legislated away almost all, if not all, of our obligations under the Refugee Convention, who has put the very notion of seeking asylum and becoming a refugee at risk and at question, who has now legislated, in fact, to even for people who are provided with the status of refugee and protection, that can now be taken away under Australian law, which is something unprecedented. And now we've exported this, not only a privatised system of pain and suffering. The UK and many right-wing governments around the world are copying, what they see as Australia's model of offshoring innocent people. But we're actually contributing to the breakdown of the international compact and the way that vulnerable people are dealt with. And I'm pleased to say that my dog agrees. So I'll share with you the other speech now. I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I do think that what's happened in the last 20 years, it's so important for us to overcome, and we can only overcome it by really going back to the source a couple of hundred years ago, how we've had this constant cycle of cynical politicians right throughout our history, triggering the Australian national psyche for Australia as a nation to demonise particular groups, either who were trying to come or who had newly arrived. And this has been a phenomenon that's occurring in very recent times. So thank you. I'm just going to share this here now. I thank you for the opportunity to speak and for the invitation. I congratulate you on getting together, and I wish you the best for the remainder of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if we were in a room, Craig, there'd be enthusiastic applause, because I think what you've done there is really sum up in a nutshell a lot of the challenges, the atrocities in terms of public policy and the whole ethos that we have found ourselves in here. So thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your the link to that address, and we really appreciate you coming on. Okay, so now we're moving on. Shabnam Safa will speak to us. Now, Shabnam arrived in Australia as a teenager, and her family were refugees from Afghanistan, having lived for some time in Pakistan in transition. So she understands very clearly and knows a lot about the refugee communities here in Australia, but also internationally. So Shabnam chairs the National Refugee-led Advisory and Advocacy Group. She's worked in a range of countries promoting education and global citizenship. and through not-for-profit organisations that she's co-founded also. You've been busy, Shabnam. So we're going to hand over to you and hear from you, particularly some of the effects of the policies that we currently have in place, and any thoughts you have on where you think we should be going. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie, and thank you everyone else for giving me your time on your evening as well. Can I also especially acknowledge Abbas joining us all the way from New Zealand? I suppose you're further down in your evening than us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this too. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm dialing in today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any First Nations people in this virtual room with us tonight. I think as a refugee, as a settler, as someone who has found safety and protection here in Australia, it's even more important for me to ground myself in the recognition of the history, the dark history that Australia has towards the First Nations people, and that their struggle for self-determination and their oppression is still ongoing. And I don't think we can reach any sort of justice in any form for refugees and people seeking asylum unless there is holistic justice for everyone oppressed in Australia. As Marie mentioned, I consider myself a child of war. I grew up as a refugee from Afghanistan in Pakistan. So, whilst I didn't grow up in the war zone, very much was a recipient of all the impacts and the intergenerational trauma and everything else that has been passed on since then. But what has happened in Afghanistan in the last 7 months has really pulled me back into, I suppose, my roots, and has awakened just a different layer of trauma that I didn't know existed. And I do want, and that's one of the ways the refugees live their lives. I've lived away from the immediate impacts of conflict, but last year with the crisis in Afghanistan, it got to a stage where I felt like I was captured by the Taliban, and I was dreaming about it every night, and so the sense of reality and nightmares, and they're all essentially merged together. And I'm prefacing my points with that because we never know how far the impacts and trauma of people who have lived through these experiences go. How many generations it really extends. I have watched my parents in the last 7 months relive the traumas of war that they've already been through. The traumas of oppression of the Taliban that they've already been through, but live it in a much more complicated way, because now they are here in Australia, and in a sense their survivor guilt has just made it so much worse for them, because they feel like they cannot do anything to help. And I have felt that very much myself. So coming out of that, and with what's happening in Ukraine right now, that crisis has added another layer of trauma for refugee communities across the globe. The catastrophe in Ukraine, the loss of life, the tragedy is huge, and it's re-triggering for so many of us. My parents say that it's the same aggressor, or it's the same oppressor. It's the same tanks that they woke up to one morning in Kabul, and so seeing that broadcasted or live on international media is just bringing up another layer of suffering for so many of us. So I just want to make that point, because we as refugees, people who have lived through this, can never run away from it. Most of my work is in this space. My job is in this space, I chair the National Refugee-led Advisory and Advocacy Group, and that was solely brought together because we wanted to include lived experience in all discourse that happens about people seeking asylum and refugees, because, you know, lived experience is not just talking about your stories, or including lived experience is not just storytelling. It is so much more than that. It's including people in your day-to-day advocacy, in the operations, at the strategic level, and really being okay with that discomfort that comes with that as well. I just quickly wanted to talk about, we'll build on some of the points that Craig mentioned around how we've changed our language over the years, and, you know, the dehumanizing of refugees, and what has and everything that has led to the state of policy that we have right now. Essentially, you know, we've changed our language, and I'd say it has increasingly gotten worse. That change in language has in turn changed our thoughts, and that has led to discriminatory policy. So if we think about it, it's not something that has happened overnight. It has happened over the last 20, 21 years or longer than that. So, you know, for the first time, I suppose after the 9/11 attacks and the Tampa affair, refugees and people seeking asylum were more associated with war and terror than needing safety and protection. And we've allowed for that to continue on, and that demonization of refugees and people seeking asylum being used by political leaders for political gain. You know, some would argue that the whole Tampa affair and 9/11 was what a rescue for the Howard government at the time. You know, that's what saved, and in that opportunistic nature that our politicians have continually capitalized on, that needs to stop. And Craig mentioned that, you know, media has a huge role to play in that. You know, after the whole Tampa affair, after the children overboard affair, the policies have continually gotten worse. You know, we have reopened closed detention centres, we've reintroduced temporary protection visas, we've our humanitarian program has increasingly gotten has reduced in size over the years, and it's all happening in increments, which, you know, when you think about it, it's not a lot, but over time it has the changes have been drastic. And you know, it's a little strange talking about this right now, because last week we actually did have some good news in the Australian refugee policy space with the announcement of additional humanitarian visas for people fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan, you know, with people who were detained for 9 years or longer being freed from detention, with Australia accepting the New Zealand deal. And so it's quite hard for good news to come around in this space, and not taking away from, you know, how much that's needed and welcomed by the community. It does make me think that if we wait 9 years, 10 years, 20 years, I suppose we would take any news as good news and celebrate it and then go on about our merry way. Because I think about how much the Afghanistan diaspora community in Australia have put in, how relentless their advocacy has been over the last 7 months, and I've been included in part of that endeavour. And we had to wait for a federal budget for an announcement like that to happen. And, you know, if that is not political gain, or if that is not a political game, I don't know, you know, how much, more obvious it could get, you know. And I suppose the double standards as well, you know, there's a narrative of a good refugee versus a bad refugee that has developed over time in Australia, that, you know, those who the government chooses or cherry picks from the top of the pile are considered good refugees, but anyone else who sought protection by boat over the last 2 decades aren't considered or aren't considered worthy of the same compassion. You know, we've with the additional announcement of visas for Afghanistan, that is so great. You know, that is a lifeline for 16,500 additional people. But I also can't stop thinking about the nearly 5,000 people from Afghanistan who are on temporary protection visas, who have been suffering in limbo without any lifeline or any services or any support afforded to them by the government, and continuously living in that uncertainty, never able to get on with their lives, essentially. You know, that's sort of the double standard at play right now across our policies in this space. And I think going into the federal election, it's really important for us to remember all of that, and you know, think about how much the change in language over time has made us accept things, and has also made us be okay with breadcrumbs, essentially, from our policy makers. So Australia's history really is a history of people turning up on boats. I don't know if there's any other nation that can claim that more than Australia, but you know, we are fundamentally boat people, all of us, but how we have allowed, as a whole society, for that to somehow be an illegal thing to do is really a responsibility that we all need to take. And in terms of advocacy, community coming together, banding together on this issue, you know, I think this is that momentum, that movement is really incredible, and it's great, but we need to make this everybody's issue. It's not just the advocates' issue, it's not just the government or the refugee community's issues, it's everybody's issue in the society. It's, you know, our media, it's our private sector, it's the sports sector, like Craig talked about, and we need to bring everyone else along on that journey with us. And that sometimes means, you know, having conversations where the other person doesn't have that assumed knowledge that we do, and you know, bring it, that initial contact of a person who isn't involved in this space with this movement is incredibly important. We need to bring more people and not alienate others from this space. So, you know, I think our advocacy needs to remain quite intuitive and quite meaningful, but also hold people to account, hold our policymakers to account, hold our civil society to account, you know, hold anyone who has a platform and who's contributing in one way or another to the hardening and the worsening of asylum and refugee policies to account. Because we can't really say it's also been one government, you know, it's been the current government. We've had the Labor government also introduce quite draconian laws. So it's sort of everybody's responsibility. I'm going to stop there for now, but happy to take on comments and questions later.
Thank you very much, Shabnam. We really appreciate that overview from your perspective. It's so important to have that lived experience perspective and involvement in all of these things. There is a comment in the chat, and I'm sure, just a note to say that First Nations peoples are not boat people. I think that's pretty well established, but thank you for that reminder. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Asha. Asha Hirsch is a Senior Policy Officer with the Refugee Council of Australia. As we know, the national peak body for refugees and organisations and individuals who support them. His work involves research, policy development and advocacy on national and international issues impacting refugee communities. Asha is also a PhD candidate and a lecturer at Monash University in public law, human rights and refugee law. So Asha, you spend a fair bit of your time thinking about these issues. We've asked you to talk about the kinds of directions that our refugee policies should be going in, and you've got just on 10 minutes, maybe a little less. So you've got a hard task in front of you, I'm sure, to give us a brief overview. But thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me tonight. Thank you very much also to Shabnam and Craig for outlining the history and our ongoing concerns and development of Australia's refugee policies. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands which we're all meeting on. For me, it is the Bunurong people in Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. As Marie said, I've been asked to talk about the Refugee Council's advocacy for positive change. I'm going to share my screen to talk a little bit about that and show you some of our work. So after we've heard from Craig and Shabnam about how we got here and the concerns we have already, my job is to talk about some of the policy changes we'd like to see. This document comes from ongoing consultations starting in 2007 with the refugee sector about our key priorities in this area. We used it as our key platform in the 2019 election to highlight the issues that we wanted to see reform on. Unfortunately, we're using very similar language apart from some wins recently that Shabnam outlined going forward for this upcoming election and after the election, the areas that we want to see the government also reform. And so I'm going to be talking about some of our visions for a more positive and welcoming community in Australia and how we can get there in the law and policy change. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. There's a lot of detail that I'm not going to get over on the slides. So if you want to see the document in detail and have a read carefully, you can go to our website and look at the Platform for Change document there. I have the link here. I'll put that in the chat as well. So we have identified 5 key areas for reform in the refugee and asylum seeker policy area. That's a permanent end to offshore processing, a fair process for claiming asylum, a reform of the immigration detention system, a larger and more responsive refugee and humanitarian program, and improved engagement in Asia. So for the first position, our vision is to see Australia end the practice of offshore processing and instead process all people in Australia onshore, ending our other deterrence practices such as turning back boats in cooperation with other governments to prevent the arrival of refugees, and end its detention and deterrence approach and instead live up to our obligations under the Refugee Convention. How we propose that the Australian government can do this is resolve the situation for people currently held in PNG and Nauru, close all Australian-funded offshore detention centres, bring people all to Australia while determinations are being made about their status, as well as arranging alternative durable solutions. Now, ideally, we would like to see Australia resolve the offshore processing issue by ensuring people can be resettled in Australia and giving people permanent protection visas here. But otherwise, working with other governments around the world as well, like we have seen been a very slow development, but positive nonetheless, in terms of accepting the New Zealand offer of 450 people over 3 years, and the US resettlement deal, as well as finding alternatives such as the community sponsorship to Canada as well. Our second area for change is looking at how we process the claims of people seeking asylum in Australia. Our vision is to see people seeking asylum are treated humanely and have access to a fair and protective application process. And there are a number of areas to reform in this space. Some of them are quite technical and legal, so I won't go into all the details, but we want to see a reform of the process for assessing people's refugee claims and an end to the fast track process, ensuring that there's an independent review, ways to appeal their claims, and an independent process for that. Ensuring that those who are appointed to the AAT, this has been an issue last week and last week as well, are independent and have a non-biased approach to handling refugee claims, reforming some of the Migration Act provisions, which remove some of our references to the Refugee Convention or other international law, ending the policy of temporary protection visas and safe haven enterprise visas, and giving those people permanent protection with access to family reunion, ensuring people have access to legal funding, access to essential ongoing social security support, healthcare, work rights while they are waiting for their asylum claim to be assessed, as well as mental health supports as well. Our third area for reform is looking at the immigration detention system onshore. And our vision is where people seeking asylum are treated fairly and humanely with their human rights upheld, where mandatory and indefinite immigration detention ends, and people seeking safety are free to live in the Australian community while their claims are transparently processed. And that can be achieved by ending the mandatory detention provisions in the Migration Act. As others commented today, it's been 3 decades since those provisions were first introduced by the Labor government. Having maximum time limits on the use of immigration detention, prohibiting the use of detention of children, regulating the criteria for immigration detention, ensuring independent and judicial review of detention, where detention must be necessary, proportionate, the least restrictive means, and in the best interest of the child. Sorry, not in the best interest of the child, detention never in the best interest of the child. And ensuring that we amend other parts of the Migration Act as well, recognizing that there's been ongoing reviews into this issue for many years by the Australian Human Rights Commission and the UN bodies as well, numerous UN bodies, including the Special Rapporteur. The fourth area for reform that we've been advocating on, and as Shabnam said, have seen some more success last week, is a larger and more responsive refugee and humanitarian program, where we have a vision where our program increases significantly in size in recognition that we should be doing more to contribute to refugee protection internationally, where we can use our resettlement program strategically, that is in diplomatic ways to ensure greater protection of refugees in Asia Pacific or elsewhere as well, and looking at ways to ensure family reunion and other migration pathways are utilized as well, including community sponsorship. So here we've been advocating for an increase of the humanitarian program back up to its previous size before 2013 of 20,000 places, and then also an increase from there to at least 27,000 to 30,000 places. The current policy still remains at 13,750. But we also, as Shabnam said, we also have an additional intake now, which is very welcome for Afghan community members in an additional 16,500 places as well. But that's only for the next 4 years, and then it will, in the current policy will drop back down to 13,000 places. There's also welcome news. Late last year, the government is piloting a new community sponsorship program called the Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, which I know some of the community groups here tonight are part of. And so we want to see that continue to be supported and then expanded as well. And developing an emergency intake response so that when there are new and emerging humanitarian concerns, as we saw with the Syrian intake, now we see with the Afghan intake, we want to see that replicated and have a contingent ready to go when these emergencies happen. And finally, our fifth point of reform is looking at the ways that Australia should be improving refugee protection in Asia, where we work with the Australian government and other governments around the world to find solutions for people displaced in our region, using diplomacy, aid, and the resettlement program to address both the causes of displacement and increase access to durable solutions. A number of areas to reform here, but essentially the key is moving away from the current policies of promoting deterrence and detention. Australia's not only been promoting that within its own policies and Operation Sovereign Borders in terms of deterrence policies, but also pushing that out and advocating for other countries to also adopt similar deterrence and detention type policies in their region and in their countries. So we want to see an end to that, and where Australia can be a cooperative partner with other countries in the region to look at ways to address both the causes of displacement, as well as looking at ways that refugees can find safety and durable solutions, either in countries of first asylum or strategically working with other countries to find other durable solutions, such as resettlement as well.
That's terrific, Asher. I might just ask you to just make it just one final comment if you can, because we probably need the hand up. That's it.
That is it.
Over and out.
Yeah, thank you very much. And like I said, I'll put the link on chat if you want to actually see a lot more of this in detail. I'm happy to answer questions now or another time.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Asher. That's, there's a lot of material there, and so it'll be terrific. People can have a closer look through the detailed work there. The Refugee Council is so important in the policy work and really digging deep and where some of those alternatives need to be. So thank you very much, Asher, for coming on tonight and sharing that with us. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Claire Loughnan. She's a researcher and doctor, obviously, at Melbourne University, lecturing in criminology in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Her research focuses on border protection and responses to refugee movement, or the movement of refugees. Her PhD research included the examination of responses to the Vietnamese refugee movement in the 1970s, and she's also a research partner with an EU-funded project which called the Comparative Network of Externalisation of Refugee Policies, and her book will soon be published, her book on the institutional effects of immigration detention. Very pertinent, very relevant, sadly, as we all know. So thank you. And we've asked Claire particularly to come along because we wanted to draw some contrasts with the current situation and what happened in the 70s around the time of the Vietnamese, end of the Vietnamese War and the refugee crisis that ensued. Thank you. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mari. Thanks for asking me along and to the other speakers. And there's a lot of intersections and parallels in what we're saying, but I guess I'm going to narrow in a little bit more into the political response, I guess, in the 1970s, which I think is really instructive, but also to mention that this is a very momentary exception to quite a sorry history in Australia of how Australia treats people at the border and within the border, and we've heard that in relation to First Nations people as well today. So I thought it might help to say at the outset, and this is something Craig mentioned earlier, is that when mandatory immigration detention was introduced, it had bipartisan and widespread public support, but it was only introduced, as Minister Hand said at the time, as an interim measure. So, and yet it's become kind of embedded in a system of border protection that is, as we know, cruel and unremittingly violent and punitive, even though we saw this as, it was seen as being only interim. Similarly, as Shabnam and Asher have indicated, offshore processing, is an awful policy that has arisen in response to sometimes sort of seeking electoral support in the case of Howard's election at the time in 2011. But there's been these are things that have not come out of nowhere. They've come out of a gradual sort of cumulative process of more and more punitive responses to refugees. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I've put a link to an article, a short article I put, just a media piece, which kind of tracks that in some ways. But I want to go back to sort of the 1970s, where I think we find, even though it's momentary, but and even though I'm not wanting to put Fraser on a pedestal, because I know at the time I used to protest against his Fraser cuts at the time as a university student, but I think there's some particular things about that period that I think we can learn from. And it shows us that the harsh border protection regime was not always seen as an appropriate policy response. So government responses at this time, I think, and exemplified by Fraser's response, was one in which he focused very strongly on establishing bipartisan support. And I think that's what we're seeing lacking now. He set up under his leadership an orderly departure program, and the effect was that number of inverted commas boat arrivals was limited, and no more than approximately, I think, 2,059 people from Vietnam seeking protection here arrived in that way. So we can also see a similar policy of welcome even in the report at that time, a 1976 report. And I'm going to dwell a bit on that to give an example of how different the difference in the language and tone that report indicated. Importantly, the report at that time said that any mechanisms in place should be able to, inverted in quotes, ensure that Australia is able to respond quickly and effectively to any refugee situations which may arise in the future, end quote. These are the very things that Asher has just talked about in his presentation. So the end of the war in Vietnam in 1975 prompted hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese to flee the country in search of refuge and settlement. So the Fraser Liberal government quickly made plans for orderly resettlement. And as I said, the language of this report is worth repeating because it does recognise, as it states, and this is a quote, a compelling responsibility to take in Vietnamese refugees. It said that it's of the committee's opinion that Australia had some responsibility to assist with the evacuation of Vietnamese citizens. We believe that by being in Vietnam, Australia incurred a residual responsibility, not to mention a moral responsibility, to assist in this process. Now, we're not hearing any of that kind of language in relation to Australia's intervention in Afghanistan. None of that is coming through. Moreover, recognising the danger of refoulement of Vietnamese refugees during the 70s, Fraser observed that such a move, and I quote, wouldn't have occurred to me. It would have been wrong, ethically wrong, however you define wrong. The only right thing to do, these were people fleeing terror, he said, and it was terror for them. And that had really significant implications for the White Australia policy, especially given that Australia had signed up to the Refugee Convention in 1954. But he said you couldn't honour your obligations under that treaty and still adhere to the White Australia policy. I'm not going to talk about that at length, but it was clear that Fraser was recognising this important responsibility. So he said, and I quote, I thought we had no obligation otherwise than to take refugees in. And he described it as an additional obligation. He said, I thought we've got no option. If people weren't going to like it, we had to persuade people that we had no other option. And even if we hadn't been involved in Vietnam, I would have argued the same way, which puts, I think, to bed some views that this was just a Liberal Party view based on a support for the South Vietnamese government. I think it went beyond that in Fraser's view. There was resistance, though, and this is, I think, also instructive. He said that there was evidence of considerable opposition to his approach, both by some of his own Liberal members of Parliament, including notably John Howard at the time. But there was somewhat less opposition from his cabinet ministers and more, he said, from the department, which he said had a hard core that opposed a kind of humanitarian response. And I'm just going to read out this quote from an interview I did with him. He said, at the time, the immigration department kept saying, we can't do this, we mustn't do that. These are terrible people. We've got to have barbed wire razor fences. The government's just got to make up its mind and do what's right, said Fraser in response. So Fraser went against the department view that really was pushing for policies like mandatory immigration detention and really punitive policies as far back as the 1970s. So Fraser pushed back against that. He said that he was confronted with a number of requests from the department that asked him to introduce what they were calling reception centres, which later became, our contemporary mandatory immigration detention centres. The department was also asking him at that time to consider using the Navy to interdict boats and turn them back. There was a lot more going on before the 80s and the 90s and even 2000 in the 2000s. So I think it's really instructive to reflect on this, because the policies that we now have in place that have become so normalised have really happened over time, but there was a possibility for resistance. And Fraser was really well aware of this, I think, noting that he rejected the idea of establishing reception centres. He ensured that no planning was undertaken for these centres, despite discussions floating around regarding possible sites and modalities of processing centres. So it was clear that this was Fraser's position of welcome was not something that was comprehensively embraced. But by rejecting these proposals, Fraser was preventing the idea of these finding fertile ground. And he said, if you do the planning, even if you do the planning, you've opened the door to the idea. So for me, this was very much a question of political leadership at the time. And for Fraser, he lamented what he called the loss of leadership exercise as kind of responsibility, noting that under the policies that we've got in place today, the idea of duties and obligations seems to have gone completely, because no one's held responsible when things go wrong. And I think we're seeing that even more profoundly in the case of privatisation. So for Fraser, the difference between this period and the policies of marking the late 1980s and beyond was a difference of leadership and a difference of the choices that were made and how they were communicated, as Shabnam was pointing out. So he said that we never spoke about fear in these discussions. We spoke about tolerance, diversity, and we planned carefully. And I think this is the key difference and something to hold on to in future in terms of trying to shift the debate. The fault, I think, lies with a failure of leadership, which seems to be more concerned about the hostile responses of some parts of the electorate. And it's very clear in the research that border protection policies attract a lot of voter volatility. Major parties know this and sadly have tended to move to appease this volatility rather than show leadership on this issue. And I'm just going to finish with another statement from Fraser at the time in reflecting on this. When he was speaking with me, he said that at the time of under the policies that Howard was introducing in the early 2000s, especially after the Tampa affair, and there was a real shift towards support for the policies of One Nation. And there was an attempt by, Fraser met Kim Beazley, who was leader of the opposition at that time, and said, what is the Labor Party doing in supporting these really punitive policies and offshore processing? What is going on? And in confronting Kim Beazley as the leader of the opposition at the time, the leader of the Labor Party, he recounted to me that Kim Beazley's response was, we've lost enough rednecks to One Nation, we can't afford to lose any more. So this is clearly a political move by both parties to appease voter volatility and at all costs, really. So it really exemplifies the need for any change has to be bipartisan, because neither major political party will actually make that move on their own. So I'll just finish there. I know it's you've got a short amount of time, but happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. Gosh, there's some cause for hope when you hear that the power of that political leadership that Malcolm Fraser clearly exercised there, and interestingly went against the advice of his department. If only governments in recent times would have done that, we would have been in a very, very different situation. So thank you very much. It's really I find it heartening to hear about, I guess, the way we'd like to see things, and the thing that this is the political kind of environment we need to work towards to find our way back to decency. Thank you very much, Claire. Okay, now we're a little behind time, which probably means our Q&A is going to be pretty minimal, but I'm sure that you're all very keen to hear from Abbas. So we're not going to squeeze Abbas too much. I think we'd probably rather hear what you have to say, Abbas. As you know, you're there in New Zealand, happily so for many years, Abbas, and we're very pleased for you that that's been the result. For those of you who may not have come across Abbas, I'm not sure whether there's anyone in our circles who wouldn't know Abbas, but he's is the author of the book After Tampa, From Afghanistan to New Zealand. So as part of the Hazara community, Abbas and his family fled Afghanistan and were among the more than 400 people rescued by the Norwegian freighter, the MV Tampa, in 2001, as they tried to reach safety in Australia. And we, sadly, we all know what happened, what a story that is, and how that has set the course essentially for 2 decades of harsh, cruel and inexcusable treatment of refugees. So I'm going to hand, I do want to say that Abbas has not wasted his time in New Zealand. He's a Fulbright Scholar. He's an author. He holds a master's in security studies from Georgetown University, and I'm sure many other things. So thank you, Abbas, for coming online tonight, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Marie. And thank you all for tuning in tonight, wherever you are, the many hundreds here on Zoom and those on Facebook and elsewhere. Look, I want to build on what Shabnam, Claire, Craig and Asha have said. And I want to begin with one key word, and that is perspective. It's a word that I've received quite often when people have read my book and they said, wow, I had no idea that you went through that. I heard about the Tampa affair way back, but I had no idea the lengths and the extent to which the Australian government went to try and keep you away from reaching the lucky country. So with that word in mind, perspective, I just want to say 3 things, and I hope that you guys understand the power of that. First and foremost, the other speakers before me tonight have spoken from Australian soil, and you're talking about the ins and outs of Australian government policy from the perspective of an Australian citizen, Australian taxpayer, Australian voter. So for me, my perspective, I'll just share a couple of thoughts of being outside Australia, being a Kiwi looking from the outside in and seeing from the outside the perspectives, the dynamics on the ground. And for me personally, the way I see how the refugee debate, if you can call it that, the topic of refugees, the way it's even talked about, the very few occasions where it is, it's very much becomes a battleground. It becomes a topic where people are incredibly polarized. The very moment that you mention boat people, asylum seekers, refugees, those who are held in offshore detention, the very words that are used, it makes people react either incredibly passionately for or against the current government's policies. And so for me, from a Kiwi's perspective, looking at what's happening in Australia, I can see that it's an incredibly divided and incredibly divisive issue. Building on what Craig said before about over the last few decades, there's been this narrative of refugees being, leeches to the system, being illegals, that by exercising their fundamental right to seek shelter and safety and asylum elsewhere, that they are somehow committing a crime so outrageous that not only will we deny them the ability to arrive on the shores of the lucky country, but we will put them in prison, that we will imprison them on some rock in the Pacific in 40-degree heat and 100% humidity without ever receiving some final word on when they might be released. And so tens of thousands of activists and community organizers like yourself have to beg and plead and pressure your local MPs to finally give an inch and say, okay, if you're near death, then you might be medically evacuated to Australia and then sent back. It's an abhorrent system. And I wonder, and again, talking about perspective, I wonder what happened somewhere along the line, the psyche of Australian legislators and Australian voters who approved that, who approved their own taxpayers' money to be used in that particular way. So perspective, that's how I see what's happening in Australia. Number two, my perspective of growing up in New Zealand. The Tampa affair, which many of you recall, was, it was a hot moment for a couple of weeks and it disappeared. And to be honest, nobody actually knew what happened to those people. Those lucky 150 or so who were granted asylum by the New Zealand government at the time, Prime Minister Helen Clark, the lucky 150 or so who were granted asylum to New Zealand and the chance to begin a new life. Whatever happened to those people? They just kind of disappeared. And so the Tampa affair, which was 20 years ago, last year, if it weren't for COVID, we had a big 20th anniversary celebration in my hometown of Christchurch, New Zealand, where many of those families were resettled. The Tampa families have done incredibly well. And I just want to take a minute there to make that acknowledgement that these folks arrived with literally the clothes on their back, very limited English language skills, no financial base, no community to tap into, no networks, but they came hungry and they came having experienced some of the worst things someone could go through. I myself being one of them, right? I was 7, 8-year-old boy at the time and I remember it vividly. And so the last 20 years, when we were given the chance to rebuild a new life in New Zealand, man, we took that with both hands. And again, talking about that key word, right? It's completely changed the dynamic, where on the one hand, if you listen to some of the debates, it's like, oh, these guys will be, living on welfare, that they won't be Australian, that they won't love this country the way we do, X, Y, and Z. Well, if you look at those folks who were lucky enough to be resettled to New Zealand, my family, and my community here in New Zealand, we are incredibly proud Kiwis, and I'm so glad I support the All Blacks over the Wallabies, I'll tell you that much. And so, we've built businesses, we're in school with teachers, police officers, all the rest of it. It's an incredibly uplifting story of success, and it changes the narrative so much. And I hope that when further discussions are made about, man, are these guys going to be good Australians? Are these guys going to love our country as much as we do? That people remember the successes and those people who have come to Australia, who have come to New Zealand with nothing and learned to build a life for themselves. And finally, just to wrap this whole thing up, over the last few weeks, you and I have all seen, exactly, I'm getting a question about it right now. I was just about to tap into that. Over the last few weeks, you and I have all seen what's happening over there in Ukraine. And the response to the situation there on the ground, and the response to how Eastern European countries in particular have welcomed their fellow Eastern Europeans with open arms and said, look, you have a home here. They will pick you up from the train station. They will feed you. They will clothe you. They will house you. And yet on the very same day, those very same countries, particularly Poland and Hungary and Belarus, they are building giant fences along their border to prevent Syrians and Iraqis and Afghans and others who are also seeking asylum from the violence that is happening in their own countries. So it just puts into light, it puts into perspective the incredibly black and white contrast between those of us who have a bit of privilege and those who don't. So to wrap it all up, I want to say this, that I'm incredibly proud that my family took the risk that they did to give us a better life. I'm incredibly humbled by the opportunities that we've been presented to us here in New Zealand, and that I'm incredibly thankful to many folks like yourselves tuning in tonight and continue to advocate for a more humane Australian refugee policy. I know we got a couple of wins recently with the announcement for those extra humanitarian visas for Afghans who will be lucky enough to call Australia home. But I know there is so much more work to do. One particular area that really, really grinds my gears is this whole notion, this whole concept of a temporary protection visa. The very word is an oxymoron. How can you provide someone temporary protection? You can go ahead and build a life in Australia for yourself and your family, build a business and all the rest of it. And yet, you could be deported at the drop of a hat for whatever reason and potentially be deported back to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Temporary protection, that is the first thing that needs to go. And there are so many other rungs to the ladder. So thank you all so much for listening. I've got some great product placement right there. It's my book. It's called After the Tampa. I'll be visiting Australia in the next month or so keep an eye out for that and hopefully meet some of you all in person as well. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Abbas. And now I'm going to take some liberties. As chair, sometimes you can do that. So I'm going to ask you a question, Abbas, because we really are squeezed for a Q&A because that tends to sort of open up the discussion and take us in various directions. I think we might just sort of round off with this question that I have for you. And I'm curious because about the situation in New Zealand in terms of the politics around refugees in New Zealand. I'm sure it's not all smooth sailing over there as well in terms of community attitudes. I'd be very interested to hear your comments on that, and also your, how the sort of New Zealand resettlement deal, which of course we're all delighted that finally, after all these years, our government has accepted that. But just how that is viewed in the community. And no doubt there are different views, of course, but how do they navigate the sort of politics around it there in New Zealand?
I'll take the second half of your question first. Huge win recently with the announcement that those held in offshore detention, particularly in Nauru, will be resettled to New Zealand. That offer was made 9 years ago under the previous Key government, and it's sat on the table for almost a decade since. And obviously it came out that there was some backdoor dealing with a certain senator, and it's been accepted. And echoing Shabnam's words there's a lot of politics happening behind the scenes for that to finally cross the line. To answer your question, though, I think it's one thing has to be put to the fore immediately, and that is the very fact that we don't have the Murdoch press here in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And that allows us to have that conversation just on a more civilized and humane way, and not so much anger and bullying and all the rest of it that I see coming from the Australian media quite a bit. So when that announcement was made, it was a headline here for a day and it disappeared. And then the policymakers here in Wellington would get on with their jobs, and hopefully over the next weeks and months and years, those folks will be resettled in New Zealand, and by and large, that'll be the end of it. And it won't be some big political talking point that any of the major parties will pick up, and it'll just kind of continue on by. So I'm incredibly grateful. That deal has sat for so long, and it makes me think, it personalizes it for me, because when Helen Clark, all the way back in 2001, when she offered to, which by the way, the offer was made to break the stalemate. We were being held offshore on the Tampa for days. Mm-hmm. When Helen Clark, watching it happen, she said, look, in a bid to break the stalemate, we're going to offer to take those in family units. So that, luckily enough, included myself and my parents and my siblings. So I can only imagine that a year later, or had it been a less compassionate government, that it would have been me that would have been sent to Nauru and spent the better part of a decade over there. So how quickly my life could have been so different. And that's all it came down to, just luck and the sheer compassion and generosity of a government that was willing to kind of take a risk and listen to the people.
Thank you so much, Abbas. I'm sure, again, there'd be a big round of applause if only you could hear it. But on behalf of everybody, I'd really like to thank you for coming on. It's wonderful that you've, committed yourself to telling this story and bringing these issues to the fore. And we really appreciate that, because I'm sure, as Shabnam said, even though now it's quite removed for you, I guess, in a sense, that these traumatic experiences that happen to yourself, that happen to loved ones, that continue to happen to members of your community, all of these things are very difficult to bear, I'm sure, especially for people like yourself and Shabnam, who have those personal connections. We as advocates also feel the heaviness and the shame of it, but thank you very much for staying in a space and being such an articulate advocate and spokesperson on these issues. Really appreciate you coming on tonight. So I'd like to, at this point, just thank all of our speakers for coming on. It's been terrific to have you on board. Just before you all run away, we did want to just wanted to hand over to Bianca Faya. She's from Amnesty, and Bianca will just run you through a couple of actions that we can be thinking of taking, and then we're going to wrap up and let you all get on with your evenings. So over to you, Bianca.
Perfect. Thanks, Mari. Hi, everyone. As Mari introduced me, my name's Bianca. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri country. Okay, so we just want you to do a couple of really easy things, and that's because we can't just sit and hope for things to happen for our government to make change. We have to pressure the government to make these changes, and that's because our government is relentless and stubborn, so we have to force that change. So the first thing that I want you all to do is to sign the Amnesty petition to compel the Australian government to increase the refugee intake. 2 minutes. Do it over while you have make a cup of coffee, sign the petition, won't take you long. Okay. So the second thing, and I'm just going to put them in the chat after I speak, is I want you to visit the ARAN website. It is amazing. It has got so much information on things that you can do, from lobbying your MP to information on educational events on how to create community awareness on refugee issues, and information on rallies and upcoming events. So visit the ARAN website. And the last thing, we want to see you all at Palm Sunday. Okay, so the ARAN website, I'm pasting it right now. If it's going to work for me.
I'll share it for you as well.
So the ARAN, so join us on Palm Sunday. The ARAN website has information on all the Palm Sunday events in all the different states. So you can just find an event in your state and join us. For those of you joining in Victoria, we will be at the State Library. And Gordon has kindly shown us the ARAN website that has all the different types of information on how you can take action. So really simple. But other than that, that's pretty much it from me. Thank you so much. Back to you, Mari.
Okay, thank you very much, Bianca, and thank you, Gordon, for doing that screenshot. It was fantastic. So it's 8:15, which means that we're pretty much due to finish up. We do encourage you, as Bianca said, to get involved around Palm Sunday. Hopefully you can attend an event. If not, go to that ARAN website, and there are some suggested online actions there, as well as the Amnesty petition, which Bianca has spoken about, which is around the refugee quota and how important it is that we get that quota up. So just in closing, I'd encourage you all to stay positive. Keep working those politicians your local candidates are really important, especially at this time in the coming election, that you let your local candidates know that you care about the refugees, that you care about the approach that we take here in Australia, and that you want to see it turn around to a decent and compassionate response. And we've heard tonight that that's possible. Thank you very much, Claire, for telling us, so clearly that political leadership is something that's possible and something that we must keep insisting on with our politicians. So I'd like to thank all those who helped us organise tonight, the forum as well, our friends at Amnesty and others on the ARAN committee. Thanks to everyone. So hopefully we'll see you again at some other time in another forum, because that's been fabulous to hear from you all. One last round of applause for our speakers. Okay, thank you all. That's we'll leave it at that, and see you another time. Thank you very much.